The game has moved past you, Daniel. It's time you accepted that some coaches simply have an expiration date. That's what Chairman Roland Ashcombe told me the day he fired me from Kingsley United after 11 years. 14 months later, I stood in the center circle of the National Stadium watching his club lose the biggest final of the season to the team he'd told the press wasn't worth my time. My name is Daniel Whitlock. I was 56 years old when Kingsley United fired me, and this is the story of the season between that sentence and that final whistle. I'd managed Kingsley United for 11 years. I'd taken them from mid-table obscurity to 2 league titles and a run of European nights the club had never experienced before or since. I want to say that plainly without false modesty because what happened next only makes sense if you understand exactly what I'd actually built there. I'd arrived at a club that hadn't finished in the top half of the table in 6 years, inherited a squad most pundits had already written off for another mid-table campaign, and spent my first 18 months rebuilding the entire training methodology from the ground up before we ever saw meaningful results on a Saturday afternoon. The first title, when it finally came, felt like the culmination of every unglamorous, unphotographed hour of work that preceded it. The second, 3 years later, felt like proof the first hadn't been an accident. The last 2 seasons had been harder. The board had sold 2 of my best players without consulting me, replaced them with signings I'd argued against, and then, when results predictably suffered, decided the problem sitting in front of them was easier to solve than the problem sitting in the boardroom. Roland Ashcombe had become chairman 18 months before he fired me, inheriting the club from his father and immediately deciding it needed modernizing. He called me into his office on a wet Tuesday morning, didn't offer me a seat, and told me the board had decided to go in a different direction. 11 years, Roland, I said. 2 titles. I think I've earned a conversation longer than 90 seconds. The game has moved past you, Daniel, you said. It's time you accepted that some coaches simply have an expiration date. Football's evolved. Data, pressing systems, players who train on tablets instead of tactics boards. I need someone who speaks that language fluently, not someone still coaching like it's 15 years ago. I built 2 title-winning sides on the exact principles you're calling outdated, I told him. You built them a decade ago, he said. The game doesn't care what you built. It cares what you're building now. And for 2 seasons, the answer has been considerably less than it used to be. I asked him whether he'd considered that selling my best players out from under me without consultation might have had something to do with that. I considered it, he said. I decided a manager worth his reputation should be able to succeed regardless of the hand he's dealt. Apparently I was wrong to expect that from you specifically. That's an interesting theory of management, I told him. I look forward to watching you apply it to whoever you hire next, once they inherit a squad you've hollowed out the same way. He didn't have a response to that beyond a tight, humorless smile, the kind men in his position give when they've already decided the conversation is over, regardless of what's actually said in it. He announced my dismissal to the press 2 hours later using almost the exact same phrase. Kingsley United has decided the time has come for a new footballing philosophy, one better suited to the modern game. The headlines the next morning were considerably less generous than that sentence. Most of them used the word finished. I want to tell you about the 2 weeks after that because I think they matter more than people usually admit in stories like this one. I sat in my house mostly alone rewatching match footage from my own teams over the past 2 seasons, looking for the version of myself Ashcombe had described in every frame. I found some of it, honestly. A few tactical decisions I'd have made differently with thinner information. But I also found, over and over, a squad being asked to execute a system with half its key components sold out from underneath it, and a manager doing everything humanly possible to make an impossible situation work anyway. My wife, Eleanor, found me at nearly 2 in the morning during one of those sessions, still watching a match from 8 months earlier, pausing every few seconds to make notes in a book I'd already filled twice over. She didn't tell me to stop. She just sat with me for almost an hour the way she'd done during difficult stretches throughout our entire marriage before finally saying quietly, "You're not looking for what went wrong, Daniel. You're looking for permission to still believe in yourself. You don't need his permission for that. You never did." The job offers that came in during those 2 weeks were, without exception, considerably beneath what I'd built at Kingsley. My agent, a patient man named Terrence who represented me for 2 decades, told me honestly that most clubs simply assumed the reporting was accurate. Finished, past it, not worth the risk. Habit Fairhaven Town called on a Thursday afternoon. Bottom of the 2nd Division, 7 points from safety, a training ground that hadn't been renovated since before I'd started managing professionally at all. Their chairman, a genuinely decent man named Colin Presswick, who'd inherited a club perpetually one bad season from bankruptcy, told me plainly he couldn't pay anywhere near what I'd earned at Kingsley. and that most people would consider this a step backward at the end of a career, rather than the middle of one. I remember driving out to see the training ground myself before agreeing to anything, standing in a car park with weeds growing through cracked asphalt, watching a groundskeeper patch a section of pitch that clearly needed more than patching. Colin met me there himself, no assistant, no press officer, just a tired, honest man who told me the club's entire annual budget was smaller than what Kingsley had once paid for a single squad player's release clause. I know exactly what this looks like from the outside, he told me. I just think you might be exactly the kind of stubborn this club actually needs right now. I told him I'd think about it. I already knew driving home that evening that I'd already decided. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made in my car that night, because it's the hinge this entire story turns on. I could have waited for a better offer, taken a television punditry role, quietly let the finished narrative calcify into the official record of my career the way these narratives usually do, uncontested, simply because contesting them takes more energy than most people have left after being publicly humiliated. Or I could take the worst job in professional football and build something Ashcombe would eventually have to watch, in real time, whether he wanted to or not. I called Colin back the next morning and accepted the job before he'd finished explaining the actual salary. Eleanor drove out with me to Fairhaven Stadium the following week, the first time either of us had seen it in person rather than in the handful of photos Colin had sent along with the contract. She stood next to me in the empty stands, looking out at a pitch considerably smaller and considerably more worn than anything either of us had grown used to over 11 years at Kingsley, and told me, quietly, that she thought this was exactly the right decision, for reasons that had very little to do with revenge and a great deal to do with who she'd watched me become during those 2 humiliating weeks at home. You need something to build again, she said. It doesn't matter how small it looks from the outside right now. Fairhaven Town's squad, when I arrived, was talented in exactly the way most struggling lower division squads are talented, individually capable, collectively disorganized, playing a system that asked nothing specific of anyone and therefore got nothing specific in return. I brought in Marcus Webb, my assistant of 9 years at Kingsley, one of the only people who'd actually called me during those 2 humiliating weeks instead of quietly distancing himself from a finished manager's reputation. Marcus had turned down 2 considerably better offers to follow me to a relegation-threatened club nobody outside the division had heard of. You're either the most loyal man I know, I told him, or the worst judge of career opportunities in English football. Possibly both, he said. Ask me again in May. My first day meeting the actual squad was considerably less glamorous than any first day I'd had at Kingsley. 16 players in a converted community center gymnasium, because the training ground's indoor facility had flooded the previous winter and never been properly repaired. I remember standing in front of that group, most of them convinced this appointment was either a joke or a man's last, sad attempt to stay relevant, and telling them plainly that I hadn't taken this job to coast quietly toward retirement. I'd taken it because I intended to prove something, and I needed all 16 of them to decide, individually, whether they wanted to be part of proving it or simply spectators to whatever happened next. Most of them looked skeptical. A few looked interested. That was enough to start with. We rebuilt Fairhaven's entire tactical identity around something I'd been quietly developing for years at Kingsley but had never been allowed to fully implement, given the board's preference for signings that photographed well in the club shop rather than players who fit a specific system. The core idea was simple, even if the execution wasn't. Most teams at this level defended in a settled, predictable shape, comfortable absorbing pressure because their opponents rarely had the patience or the personnel to actually punish that comfort. I built Fairhaven around relentless positional rotation, players interchanging zones constantly enough that opposing defenders, trained their entire careers to mark a position rather than a specific threat, simply lost track of who they were supposed to be watching. I spent the first months simply teaching players to trust the system before they could execute it properly. A harder task than it sounds when half the squad had spent their careers being told, at every level, to stay disciplined in their assigned position above all else. Marcus ran individual sessions with 3 of the more skeptical veterans, walking them through a video of exactly why the rotation created space rather than chaos, until skepticism slowly gave way to the specific, quiet confidence that comes from watching a plan actually work in training before it's ever tested in a real match. It took 11 games to click properly. We lost 4 of them. I watched 2 local papers run headlines suggesting Fairhaven had hired their own version of Finished to manage them into the 3rd division instead of out of relegation trouble. Colin found the budget somewhere to finally repair that flooded indoor facility around Game 7, a small gesture that meant more to the squad's morale than I think he fully understood at the time. I remember the specific afternoon the repair facility reopened. Players jogging through it almost reverently, the way people treat something they genuinely stop believing would ever actually improve. It wasn't much, by the standards of a club like Kingsley. It was, for Fairhaven, a signal that somebody in a building actually believed the investment might eventually be worth making. There was a young winger on that squad, a 19-year-old named Jamie Osei, technically gifted, but wasted for 2 seasons in a rigid system that asked him to stay wide and cross the ball, the one thing he was genuinely bad at. I moved him inside, into the exact rotational space our new system was built around, and watched a player nobody else in the division had rated suddenly become the most dangerous attacking midfielder outside the top 2 divisions. Jamie told me months later that he genuinely considered leaving football entirely the previous summer, convinced 2 wasted seasons on the wing meant he simply didn't have what it took at any level. I told him the problem had never been his ability. It had been a manager asking a genuinely gifted player to do the one thing he was worst at, over and over, until both of them mistook the mismatch for a lack of talent. I also brought in a striker named Ryan Cole on a free transfer, 22 years old, released from Kingsley United's own academy 4 years earlier by a decision I later learned Ashcombe had made personally, overruling his own academy coaches, who'd rated Ryan as one of the most promising forwards the club had developed in a decade. Ashcombe released you? I asked him during his first training session. Said I didn't have the right profile for where the club was heading, Ryan told me. I've spent 4 years trying to figure out what that actually meant. It meant nothing, I told him. It just sounded like something. By March, Fairhaven Town had climbed clear of relegation entirely and embarked on an unlikely run through the National Cup, the domestic knockout competition that pits clubs from every division against each other in a single elimination bracket. We beat a top division side in the 4th round, a result the football press treated as a delightful anomaly rather than evidence of anything systematic. I remember that 4th round match specifically. Our part-time analyst staying up until 3 in the morning, breaking down our opponent's defensive tendencies from grainy footage, because Fairhaven's budget didn't stretch to the professional scouting services Kingsley had taken for granted throughout my entire tenure there. We won 2-1, a Jamie Osei goal in the final 10 minutes that the studio pundits afterward called a moment of individual magic, rather than the specific, deliberately engineered outcome of 4 months of positional drilling. I ran into Ashcombe in a league event in February, the first time we'd spoken since he fired me. He found me near the bar, glass of wine already in hand, and I watched him decide how to play the encounter before he'd said a single word. Daniel, he said, I hear Fairhaven's having quite the little cup run. Charming, really, watching a lower division side punch above its weight for a few rounds before reality reasserts itself. It's interesting you call it charming, I told him, considering the tactical system producing that little cup run is the exact one you told the press was 15 years out of date. His smile tightened, just slightly. Cup runs happen to unfashionable clubs every season, Daniel. It rarely means anything by May. We'll see, I said, though I noticed Kingsley's own cup form this season has been considerably less charming than ours. I heard your new manager's pressing system leaked 11 goals in 6 matches. Modern language evidently doesn't always translate to modern results. He didn't have an immediate response to that. I finished my drink, told him it was lovely catching up, and walked away, leaving him standing there the way I imagine plenty of people have left, plenty of powerful men standing exactly like that, working out what to say 5 minutes too late to actually say it. Fairhaven reached the National Cup semi-final in April, a result no preseason prediction in the country had come remotely close to forecasting. Kingsley United, meanwhile, stumbled through their own bracket unconvincingly, surviving 2 replays against considerably weaker opposition than anything Fairhaven had already beaten outright. I remember the exact moment the semi-final draw was broadcast live, Marcus and I watching it together in my office, both of us going quiet at the exact same second the presenter read out the final pairing. The office itself was little more than a converted storage room with a desk and 2 mismatched chairs, considerably smaller than the space I'd once occupied at Kingsley, though I found I minded that considerably less than I once assumed I would. Kingsley United versus Fairhaven Town. The winner would play in the National Cup final at the National Stadium, in front of 80,000 people and a television audience of millions. Well, Marcus said after a long silence, I suppose the universe has a sense of humor. Hadifally, We won that semifinal 3-2 in extra time, Jamie Osei scoring twice from the exact rotational space Kingsley's current system had no answer for, because it was a space I designed specifically to exploit a defensive shape I'd once helped install at that very club, over a decade earlier before Ashcombe's modernization had abandoned the defensive discipline underneath it without replacing it with anything coherent. I remember standing on the touchline during extra time, watching Kingsley's current manager make substitutions I recognize as pure panic rather than considered strategy, the specific kind of decision-making that happens when a system starts failing and nobody in the technical area fully understands why, because the person who designed the underlying principles is standing on the opposite touchline instead. Ashcombe didn't attend the semi-final in person, according to reports. I found the detail almost more satisfying than the result itself. National Cup final took place on a bright Saturday afternoon in May. Fairhaven Town against Kingsley United, at a stadium I'd walked out onto as a winning manager 4 times before, always wearing Kingsley's colors, never imagining I'd return wearing anything else. I stood in that tunnel for a long moment before kickoff, running my hand along the same wall I'd touched 4 times previously, in a different jacket, representing a different set of ambitions than the ones I carried into that stadium now. Some part of me expected to feel nostalgic. What I actually felt was considerably simpler than nostalgia. A specific, focused calm, the same clarity I imagine most people feel right before the thing they spent months preparing for finally arrives. I saw Ashcombe briefly before kickoff, in the tunnel, both of us walking toward our respective dugouts. He stopped just for a moment. Enjoy today, Daniel, he said. Whatever happens, I imagine this is the highlight of whatever's left of your career at this point. Funny, I told him. I was about to say something similar to you. Except I don't think today is going to be a highlight for either of us in quite the way you're imagining. The match itself unfolded almost exactly the way 11 games of trial and considerable error had taught me it would. Kingsley's current system, still built loosely on the defensive shape I'd installed a decade earlier, but stripped of the specific discipline that made it work, had no coherent answer for Fairhaven's constant positional rotation. I watched their center backs make the exact same mistake over and over that I'd designed this entire system to punish, marking a zone instead of a runner, ceding exactly the half-second of hesitation Jamie Osei needed to exploit space that technically belonged to nobody and therefore belonged, every single time, to us. Marcus stood beside me in the technical area, calling out adjustments in the same shorthand we developed over 9 years together, a language built from thousands of hours in training grounds, considerably less glamorous than the one surrounding us that afternoon. We led 1-0 at halftime, a goal Ryan Cole scored from almost the exact spot on the pitch where, I'd later learned, Kingsley's academy coaches had once told him he had the wrong profile to ever play meaningful football for a club of that stature. Kingsley equalized 8 minutes into the second half, a moment of individual brilliance from a winger genuinely talented enough to survive even a system that didn't fully understand how to use him. I remember the specific sinking feeling of watching that goal go in, wondering whether 11 months of careful rebuilding was about to end exactly the way every headline in February had confidently predicted. I looked over at our bench, watching Jamie Osei's face for a reaction, half expecting the specific deflation I'd seen from young players before, the moment a lead disappears and belief starts quietly leaking out of a group that's never actually been this far before. Instead, I watched him clap twice, sharply, and shout something to the rest of the midfield I couldn't quite hear from the technical area but recognized instantly as encouragement rather than panic. Whatever I'd built in that dressing room over 11 months, it had apparently taken root somewhere I couldn't fully take credit for anymore. Marcus found me on the touchline during the resulting pause. Same plan, he said. Their fullbacks are exhausted from chasing rotation for 73 minutes. It gets worse before it gets better for them, not for us. He was right. It always is. Eventually, if the underlying system is actually sound rather than simply lucky for a few matches. Ryan Cole scored the winning goal in the 89th minute, the exact rotational pattern we drilled since November, Jamie Osei drawing 2 defenders out of position before laying the ball into space that had, by that point in the match, become entirely predictably ours. I watched Ryan wheel away toward our bench rather than celebrating toward the Kingsley end of the stadium, and I understood, watching him, that he wasn't celebrating against the club that released him so much as simply celebrating with the people who'd actually believed him worth building around. There's a specific difference between those two things, and I think Ryan understood it more clearly in that moment than I did watching from the touchline. I remember the specific sound the stadium made, 80,000 people making a noise I'd heard many times before, always from the other side of it is Kingsley's colors. Hearing it from this side for the first time in my career, Felt like understanding a sentence I'd been reading backward for 11 years. The final whistle blew 4 minutes later. I want to describe the next 60 seconds slowly because I replayed them more times than almost any other moment in my life. I walked out onto the pitch, into the center circle, the same specific patch of grass I'd stood on as a winning manager, 4 separate times wearing Kingsley's colors, celebrating with players who'd since been sold, coached by staff who'd since moved on, cheered by a crowd that had, 18 months later, been told by their own chairman that I was finished. I stood there and watched Kingsley United's players sink to the turf around their own penalty area. The specific posture of a team that had just understood, in real time, exactly how thoroughly they'd been outthought. I watched Ashcombe in a director's box, his face doing the same rapid, horrified recalculation I imagined my own face had done, 18 months earlier, sitting in his office being told the game had moved past me. Marcus found me a moment later, out there in the center circle, and neither of us said anything for a long moment, just standing together on the exact grass where 9 years of quiet loyalty had finally, publicly, been proven worth every considerably better offer he'd turned down to follow me here instead. It hadn't moved past me. It had simply been waiting for a room willing to let me actually build something in it again. Here's the twist I didn't see coming, the one that turned this from a sweet personal victory into something considerably larger. Marcus found me in the tunnel afterward, phone in hand, an odd expression on his face. "You need to see this?" he said. "It's already breaking." Marie Callahan's story. Marie Callahan, a financial journalist who covered Kingsley United's ownership for years, had published an investigation timed, I later learned, for maximum impact around the final, revealing that Ashcombe had spent the past 2 years quietly selling off portions of the club's training ground land to a development company he personally held shares in without full board disclosure. The Kingsley board, according to Marie's sources, had already voted 3 weeks earlier to remove him as chairman, pending a formal ownership review. Today's final had simply been the last public appearance he was contractually obligated to make before the announcement went out. I read through the full article standing in that tunnel, still in my matchday suit, understanding for the first time exactly why Ashcombe's expression in the director's box had carried something underneath the obvious disappointment of the result itself. A man who already knew, walking into that stadium, that this defeat was going to be the smaller of 2 humiliations waiting for him that particular Saturday. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, slowly, exactly what it meant. Ashcombe hadn't simply lost a cup final to the manager he'd called finish. He'd lost it as the very last act of a chairmanship that had already privately been declared over weeks earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with me at all. The man who told me some coaches simply have an expiration date had been sitting on his own, considerably less publicly announced, the entire time we spoke at that league event in February. You simply hadn't found out about it yet. I saw him one final time in the parking area outside the stadium, surrounded by a small crowd of reporters who'd clearly already heard Marie's story. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who understood exactly how small a cup final actually was, compared to what was about to happen to the rest of his week. "Congratulations, Daniel," he said quietly, no longer performing anything for anyone. "Thank you," I told him. "For what it's worth, Roland, I don't think either of us actually had an expiration date. I think we both just needed the right people around us to find out what we still had left." He didn't say anything else. I watched him walk toward a waiting car, cameras following him the entire way, and understood that whatever came next for him was going to unfold in front of an considerably less forgiving than the one that had just watched his team lose a cup final. Kingsley United's board formally removed Ashcombe as chairman 11 days later, the ownership review confirming most of what Marie Callahan's initial reporting had already revealed. He hasn't held a position in professional football since, as far as I know, though I understand he's given a handful of interviews since then, none of which, according to people who actually read them, mention the phrase expiration date even once. Fairhaven Town's chairman, Colin Presswick, offered me a new 5-year contract 2 days after the final, along with the kind of investment in the club's training facilities that should have happened a decade before I ever arrived. I signed it without negotiating a single clause. Marcus stayed on as my assistant, obviously. Jamie Ossie's signed his first professional contract extension the following week, and Ryan Cole, the player Ashcombe personally decided didn't have the right profile, scored the goal that ended Ashcombe's chairmanship in every way that actually mattered, 4 minutes before a very different kind of ending arrived for him entirely on its own. I had a quiet moment with Ryan a few days after the final, both of us staying late after training for no particular reason except that neither of us was quite ready for the season to fully end yet. He asked me whether I thought Ashcombe ever regretted releasing him specifically, or whether it was simply one decision among hundreds he'd made without much thought either way. I told him I honestly didn't know and that I'd stopped finding the answer to that particular question, especially important somewhere around the 89th minute of the final. What mattered considerably more, I told him, was what he'd built since, regardless of whether the man who released him ever spared it a second thought. I think about that whole 14 months often and what it actually taught me. Not that revenge tastes sweet, though I won't pretend standing in that center circle didn't feel exactly the way I'd imagined it might during some of the darker nights that first month after my dismissal. What it taught me was something quieter than that. The narrative that gets told about you the moment you're publicly humiliated is never actually the whole truth. It's simply the version that's convenient for whoever's telling it at the exact moment they need you to disappear quietly. Eleanor asked me, a few weeks after the final, whether I felt like the past 14 months had finally settled something in me that had been unsettled since that Tuesday morning in Ashcombe's office. I told her I thought so, though not in the way I might have expected. Sitting in that office being told my career was effectively over. It wasn't the winning that settled it, exactly. It was watching Jamie Ossie and Ryan Cole and a groundskeeper still patching that cracked car part build something nobody outside Fairhaven ever expected them to build, together, in a room nobody else wanted. I got to stand in the middle of that. That mattered more in the end than anything Ashcombe said or didn't say to a room full of reporters. If you've ever been told you were finished, past it, no longer worth the investment, by someone who mistook a temporary setback for a permanent verdict, I understand that particular humiliation better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for answering it. I only know that the answer is rarely found in the room that rejected you. It's usually found in the much smaller, much less glamorous room nobody else wanted, waiting for someone stubborn enough to actually build something in it. Hath, thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a time someone declared you finished before you'd actually decided that yourself, I'd love to hear about it. Whatever room you're standing in right now, smaller and less glamorous than the one you lost, I hope you find exactly the kind of stubborn this story is actually about. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.